So welcome back everyone. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy 2025 Mains Question Paper Analysis. So through this analysis, we are understanding the important themes which are repeated, which are important for the mains examination. And apart from that, we are also understanding the structure and the presentation of the answers. Now today also we have some more important questions. So we'll be understanding the framework of the answers, structure of the answers, and also the important themes which are being repeated by the UPSC every year. The question is, how do you account for the growing fast food industries? Now food industry or food sector is another very important theme that UPSC has been repeating number of times. Now in this question, how do you account for the growing fast food industries given that there are increased health concerns in modern society? Now you have to illustrate your answer with the examples or Indian experience examples, right? So therefore, the fast food industries, we all knew, have health concerns. Particularly a country like India with 140 crore population, most of the population are youth. So therefore, you have to illustrate your answer with the Indian experience. Now in the introduction, you just have to write that despite health awareness among the people about the fast food industries and the health risk that the fast food industry poses to the Indian population, the fast food industry is growing at a rapid pace in India. So therefore, you can mention some data with respect to the growing fast food industries, right? So it's health concerns. If there's any report, you could mention the report as well in the introduction. And in the conclusion part of this answer, you have a certain dimensions and you need to mention all these important dimensions one by one. For example, urbanization and lifestyle change is one dimension, affordability and convenience is another dimension, and aggressive marketing and consumerism and digital delivery apps like Swiggy, Zomato, and then the youth-driven consumption patterns. So these are important dimensions that you have to mention your answer. And in fact, in the beginning, as I have already told you, that India is a country with a huge youth population. So therefore, there will be a growing health concerns which may be associated with the fast food industries in India. And in the conclusion, you just have to write that fast food growth persists, but awareness is slowly shaping the healthier choices and adaptations. And always make sure the conclusion is optimistic and positive in its outlook, so that it could leave the examiner with the best impression about your answer. Now going into the answer, first of all, you have to write the introduction for this answer. Now in the introduction, you just have to mention that the youth are aware about the health risks posed by the fast food industry. Now when you talk about the health risks posed by the fast food industry, the health risks including obesity and heart related diseases. And in fact, the fast food industry in India mostly causing diseases like obesity and heart diseases. So despite such threats, there has been a robust growth for the fast food industry in India. So therefore, overall, it has been reflecting the varied socio-economic and cultural factors which have been shaping the food choices of India's population. So you could introduce this answer this way, or you could also mention some relevant data, or you can also quote any report in the introduction. Now coming back to the body part of the answer, so as I've already told you that there are certain dimensions, you have to mention all these dimensions one by one with adequate amount of data and examples. Now let's understand what are the factors behind the fast food sector growth. Now the first reason is the urbanization and the lifestyle changes among the youth population, because it is believed that the fast food industry offers convenience and affordability for the population. And in fact, the convenience and also affordability of the fast food became the lifeline of India's urban population. Now we all knew that in India's urban centers are growing at a rapid pace and population has also been expanding at a rapid pace. However, the fast food sector is mostly concentrated in the urban areas. Certain advantages that this fast food sector has, such as its speed, convenience and affordability, has making it a lifeline for India's urban population. because we all knew that in India's urban population, very often they have hectic work schedules and even the longer commutes as well. By 2036, around 40% of Indians are expected to live in urban areas. However, even though we have some outdated or old data, as per the 2011 population census, around 29% of India's population are living in urban areas. However, by 2036, it is expected that 40% of India's population will live in urban areas. So therefore, there will be expanding consumer or customer base for the fast food sector outlets in India over a period of time. Because as I've already told you that the fast food sector has certain advantages such as convenience, speed and affordability. And the next important dimension about the fast food sector in India is the demographics and also the economic drivers. Because India's population, if you look at demographics, most of the population are young and youth population. And in fact, we also have a large middle class population. And in fact, the dual income families and higher disposable incomes of India's population have become the fast food industry became more and more attractive, right? So in fact, there has been a demand for the fast food industry has been increasing manifold because of the middle class, young population and also the people who are the dual income families. And in fact, the food delivery platforms such as Swiggy, Zomato, Uber, and all these food delivery platforms or food delivery in shopping malls have further boosted the accessibility, food availability in shopping malls, further increase the accessibility and popularity of the fast food in India. And apart from that, another dimension is localization and consumer preferences as well. Because the fast food industry mostly suitable to the consumer preferences in recent times. And in fact, the fast food industry is also dynamic and it is being aligned with the consumer choices. And there are several multinational and domestic brands they have adapted to means to include Indian flavors. And in fact, they are also catering to the local preferences while retaining their global appeal. And in fact, the popular segments including chicken-based meals such as KFC, pizzas, burgers and sandwiches. They can also categorized as the fast food sectors. And let's understand the health paradox, which is rising health concerns and the consumer behavior changes. Because consumers have been preferring the fast food, but on the other hand, increased consumption of fast food have increasing health concerns. So in this context, it is very important that there is a need for growth awareness, health awareness growth among the youth population. And in fact, the health advocacy and government campaigns, they very usually warn against the processed and high fat foods. And in fact, they also highlight the links with the non-communicable diseases that they can actually pose. Now when I say non-communicable diseases, obesity, heart stroke or cancer, so these are all diseases which are known as non-communicable diseases. However, the fast food remains attractive due to its taste, its familiarity and aggressive marketing. And apart from that, it also has certain advantages, which is accessibility, availability and affordability of the fast food compared to the other foods. So therefore, it has been posing severe healthcare risks for India's population. So let's understand some data with respect to the fast food and its consequences on the health of India's population. It is just believed that Indian fast food market was valued at US dollars 18.6 billion in the year 2024. And in fact, it is projected to reach US dollars 35.5 billion by 2033, growing at a 7.1% of compound annual growth rate. So therefore, you can expect there will be a significant rise in the fast food industry in the coming years because of increased demand for the fast foods. And in fact, there are multinational companies like McDonald's, KFC, Domino's and several Indian startups including Wow Momo and Fasos. So all these fast food based companies have rapidly expanded in metros and even tier 2 cities as well. So therefore, it is expected that in future, the fast food industry grow at a multifaceted manner with a rapid scale. Now, in the conclusion of this answer, you just have to write that there is no doubt fast food sector poses increased health risks to the people in India. And in fact, India's fast food sector continues to grow due to the increased urbanization, changing lifestyle of the people, and also the consumption behavior as well. So therefore, this trend actually highlights the complex interplay between the convenience and also the public health, because fast food is more convenient and affordable for the people. So because of this reason, they are opting for the fast food. But on the other hand, fast food also causes severe health related problems. So therefore, there is a need for the balanced approach, and this balanced approach would look after the health of the people and at the same time the convenience, affordability and ease of access of food as well. So ultimately, in the conclusion, you should have to emphasize on the balanced approach when it comes to accessing the fast food or making it more and more healthy. Or you can also talk about increasing awareness, particularly health awareness among the people, so that the consumers can actually change their preferences and choices when it comes to food. So next important question that was asked in UPSC General Studies Paper 1 is, achieving sustainable growth with emphasis on environmental protection could come into conflict with poor people's needs in a country like India. Now, we all knew that the countries all across the world have been emphasizing on sustainable development and sustainable growth. And in fact, the countries have already adopted the SDG agenda of 2030, where you have 17 sustainable development goals. And it is expected that the 17 sustainable development goals will be achieved by the year 2030. Now, what exactly is a sustainable development? Development that meet the needs of the present generation, that meet the needs of the future generations, and at the same time the future generations, right? So if we talk about the sustainable development, so development that actually meet the needs of the present generation, and at the same time future generations, they don't compromise on their needs. So which is called as the sustainable development. Circular economy is part of the sustainable development. And if I can explain sustainable development in a better manner, imagine we all have water resources, and if we extract the water resources in an indiscriminate manner, and if we exploit the existing water resources also, the future generations will not have adequate water resources for their use. However, when we talk about the sustainable development actually means the wise use of existing water resources so that we can meet our own needs, and at the same time the future generations can also meet the needs of water, which is known as the sustainable development. Because the planet Earth and all the resources not just belong to us, they also belong to all other species, including our future generations as well. So this is the key principle which sustainable development actually emphasizes on. Now, in this context, achieving the sustainable growth with emphasis on environmental protection. Now, when you emphasize on sustainable development, you should also look after the environmental protection as well, because it is an integral component of sustainable growth and development. However, when you look after these two essential things, then it may come in conflict with the poor people's needs in a country like India. Comment. Now, you have to have a model framework for this answer, because model framework will make your answer very good and well structured. And in the introduction, you just have to mention that the sustainable growth balances the economic development with environmental protection and sustainability. However, India is a country with 21% of its poor people need to balance the environmental protection, economic development, economic growth, and also the sustainable growth as well. Because as per the 2011 census, we have 21% of the people living below poverty line. In the introduction, you just have to introduce this thing, and in the body part of the answer, it will have multiple dimensions. The dimensions including environmental loss may limit poor communities' access to resources. Secondly, green technologies may be costly. Third, development projects may cause displacement of the communities, particularly the tribal communities. And if we talk about the green technologies, countries which are developing or underdeveloped, they might not have the green technologies or the advanced technologies which could actually balance the sustainable development, environment protection, and economic growth. However, on the other hand, the developed countries are reluctant to provide us the technology and financial resources. Now, ultimately, in the conclusion, you have to emphasize on the balanced approach where we take care of the environmental sustainability, economic growth, and sustainable growth. Right? So this is how you have to write this answer, and this is the framework for the answer. And in the introduction of this question, as I've already told you, you just talk about the balanced approach. And in fact, in India, which is a country which has been trying a lot to achieve the sustainable growth, which means balancing the environmental protection, sustainable growth, and also the economic development. However, in India, economic growth and also the environmental sustainability or sustainable growth, they very often come in clash with each other, because we are a country with a huge population who are below poverty line. And in fact, around 20 to 21% of India's population are living below poverty line. So therefore, since a large vulnerable populations we have, there is a high probability that the sustainable growth goals may come in conflict with the economic with economic growth and economic development in India. So this is how you can briefly introduce this answer. And if you need it, you can also mention some data, or if there is any report, you can also quote the report in the introduction to make it more and more impressive. And then you need to talk about the sustainable growth and the environmental priorities in India. And here we have to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals Index, which is also called as SDG Index 2025. In the SDG Index of 2025, India was ranked 99th out of 167 countries. So therefore, this ranking of India has been reflecting progress in poverty reduction, but lagging on environmental goals. So remember that we also have certain environmental goals such as green energy transition, climate change, climate action. So therefore, India still lags behind climate action and clean and green energy goals. And secondly, the universal electrification, that everyone having access to electricity. So we have achieved 100% electrification throughout India. And we have provided drinking water to around 80% of the rural households. So therefore, we have ensured access to the drinking water through the Jal Jeevan mission. And we have also ensured 100% electricity access through various programs that the government has launched. And Ujjwala program has ensured that 85% of the poor households have access to the clean cooking fuel. So these programs demonstrate the gains that we have achieved in reducing the poverty. However, despite such a progress, there are still issues like water stress or water scarcity and excessive dependence on coal. We all knew that coal is a fossil fuel, and if you burn fossil fuels like coal, they release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and they will further contribute to the things like climate change and global warming. So therefore, India will not be able to achieve its goals or its international climate commitments if India continues to depend on coal to generate electricity. So let's understand the conflict with poor people's needs in India. Now, in fact, if you look at the sustainable development, it is the combination of different things. It is the combination of environmental protection and also the environmental sustainability, and then economic growth and economic development and the social progress. So therefore, essentially it is a combination of different factors. Only then we could be able to achieve the sustainable development. So let's understand the conflict between sustainable development and economic growth, economic development. And in fact, it is believed that in India around 21% of the people are living below poverty line. However, the people who are living below poverty line, they rely or they depend heavily on the natural resources. For example, they depend on land, forests and water resources for their livelihood. And in fact, in India, majority of the population still dependent on the primary sector. And in fact, these are the practices deemed as unsustainable. For example, if people in northeastern part of India, they dependent on jhum cultivation or slash and burn cultivation, so they cut down the forests and they clear the forests and they cultivate different crops. However, this may be considered as unsustainable practice. For example, firewood collection or informal mining. So don't you think that there's a clash or a conflict between the economic development and environmental sustainability? This is the first thing. Secondly, environmental regulations. If government brought in environmental regulations, so that will limit or restrain a company and its operations. For example, a developing country like India, so there are companies which are ready to invest in India. However, if government comes up with strict environmental regulations, so then that will limit companies' operations. So therefore, the companies most likely will not invest in India. In fact, if companies come to India and if they invest, they can create large-scale employment opportunities, increasing production, and also we can increase our export competitiveness. Right? So however, the sustainable growth demands strict environmental regulations. However, the economic growth obligations mandate us that there is a need to facilitate the environment which is conducive for industries to come in and invest in India. So again, there will be a clash as well. For example, shifting to renewable energy. So we have wind, solar energy. So these are the different types of the renewable energy methods. However, shifting to renewable energy further rises the power costs, because initially it is not easy to produce renewable energy. So because of the operational costs and initial setup costs, the power price will also significantly increase. So increasing power tariffs will further increase the incomes or low income households, and therefore relocating polluting industries risk job losses for the urban poor as well. Right? So let's understand this through the data and Indian experiences. Now, if you look at the data, nearly 1 in 4 urban Indians, they live in informal settlements. Now, when we talk about the informal settlements, they have limited access to safe drinking water. So they have limited access to proper sanitation and hygiene. And in fact, the people who are living in urban areas, particularly the poor people, who are more vulnerable to urban pollution, and they are also exposed to the urban municipal waste management challenges. So therefore, all these issues in the urban areas remain unresolved, and that will affect the poor communities at most. And in fact, India has achieved a lot in last 2 to 3 decades. India has also been successfully lifted millions of people out of the poverty cycle. So therefore, the development lifts millions out of poverty, resources extraction, pollution further increases, because if we wanted to achieve economic development, economic growth, we need to extract our resources and we need to use our existing resources in a proper way. So mining, extraction of the resources will further contribute to the pollution. So again, there is a conflict between the environmental sustainability and economic growth objectives. So therefore, there is a need to strike a balance between the environmental sustainability and also the economic growth objectives or obligations. Now, in the conclusion of the answer, what you have to write. So in order to achieve sustainable development goal, or sustainable development or sustainable growth is important and vital for every country across the world. However, for India, it is very, very important. However, there is a need to balance the sustainable growth, environmental protection, along with the objectives of economic growth and economic development. So in order to achieve this, the policies must integrate inclusive development, affordable green technology, transitional support, so that we can ensure that the environmental stewardship does not come at the expense of the vulnerable communities. So I hope you have understood this, and this is how you have to write this answer. So whatever theme has been asked in the question, you have to clearly reflect the theme in the question with relevant examples and adequate amount of data. So I hope you have understood this question, and let's discuss another very important topic that has been again asked. And this question is about the tribal development in India. Now remember, questions like this are very often repeated in the mains examination. So therefore, the previous year questions are one of the most important source for UPSC mains preparation. Now the question is, does tribal development in India, which centers around two axes, those of a displacement and the rehabilitation? Give your opinion. And in fact, so if we talk about the tribal population, they live in remote rural areas. However, most of the tribal people live in the mineral resource rich areas. So in order to achieve economic development, economic growth, we need mineral resources. So in order to extract the mineral resources, we need to displace the tribal communities. However, there is a displacement and also the rehabilitation issues that the tribal communities in India have been facing. Now, one best example is Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the displacement of the tribal people who are living in Nicobar group of islands. So let's understand the basic framework for this answer. Now in the introduction itself, you just have to briefly mention that the development in India has historically been shaped by state-led projects and the resource extraction. So this is very true. However, in the body part of the answer, you need to talk about the displacement, rehabilitation. For example, if you are constructing dams, mining or forests, so they are being declared protected. However, if we talk about the rehabilitation of the tribal communities or the tribal populations, the rehabilitation is very often inadequate because it lacks the cultural sensitivity and long-term support to the tribal communities. So you need to talk about the displacement, rehabilitation, and there are other concerns also that the tribal population very often facing. They are including the autonomy, the lack of autonomy for the tribal groups, education, and the land rights. Right? So therefore, they have been facing a lot of issues. And in the conclusion of this answer, what you have to write? So in the conclusion of the answer, the development must go beyond the displacement and rehabilitation of the tribal communities. So it must ensure dignity, participation, and rights-based progress. So when you write the answer, so all these essential themes must be reflected in your answer. So those themes must be shown in your answer. So what you have to write in the introduction of this question? So in the introduction, so it is being said that the tribal development in India is centered on two critical axes. Now one is displacement and another is rehabilitation. Now when you displace the tribal communities, you have to rehabilitate them as well. And in fact, the frequent forced relocations of the tribal population who are displaced recently because of the developmental projects and various other reasons. And in fact, there are inadequate efforts to relocate and rehabilitate the tribal groups or the tribal populations who are displaced because of the various reasons, and that will impact their lives and the livelihoods in the long term. Now let's understand the displacement of the tribal communities and its causes. Now if we talk about the displacement of the tribal communities, so tribal communities often live in the resource rich areas. Remember, as I've already told you, that the tribal communities live in the mineral resource rich areas, but geographically they are remote areas, they are isolated areas. For example, the northeastern part of India, the central India, and also the various other parts which are isolated or remote areas. So therefore, they are more and more vulnerable because they don't have autonomy, they don't have education, they don't have the knowledge over their rights. So therefore, they are the most vulnerable people. Now in case displacement of the tribal communities takes place, then there will be an inadequate relocation attempts or the rehabilitation attempts. And in India, the displacement of tribal communities very often takes place because of the dams, mines, and the industrial zones. So the best example is Sardar Sarovar Dam. And in fact, the Sardar Sarovar Dam has displaced around 41,000 families, including the majority of tribals in states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh. And in fact, the displacement of the tribal communities also causes the loss of land, the loss of cultures, loss of their traditional livelihood rights. And in fact, they will also face the socio-economic marginalization due to the uprooting from their ancestral lands, and this is crucial and important for their survival. And let's understand the rehabilitation challenges and the policies which are associated with it. And in fact, the rehabilitation efforts aim to restore the displaced tribals. In fact, even though for the namesake rehabilitation attempts are being taken, but very often they are a failure, because the rehabilitation efforts very often fall short of because of the inadequate planning, underestimation of the affected families, and also insufficient land or monetary compensation provided to the tribal populations. Secondly, the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition or Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013. So this legislation deals with the land acquisition and fair compensation to the people from whom land has been acquired. So it actually provides certain legal safeguards and also mandates the Gram Sabha consultations before acquisition of land in the scheduled areas. However, the problem is that this particular legislation is not properly implemented, and the tribal people also don't have adequate awareness about the legal safeguards available to them in case of land is acquired in an illegal way. However, despite policies, effective rehabilitation remains limited in India. And in fact, many displaced tribal face unemployment, loss of traditional livelihoods, and also the cultural erosion as well. Right? So these are the issues that the people who are living in the tribal areas have been facing. So let's understand the other that are actually associated with the tribal population. So tribal development requires a broader and the participatory approach. And it is very important that we should emphasize on the participatory approach, the stakeholder approach, the multi-stakeholder approach. So this approach must be broader and comprehensive in nature, because such an approach will empower the tribal communities through education, healthcare, and even economic opportunities. And this will also lead to the protection of the cultural identity so that it will not lead to the socio-economic marginalization. However, the modern discourse of development emphasizes on inclusive growth models, integrating the tribal rights with the sustainable resource use beyond mere displacement and rehabilitation frameworks. Right? So therefore, the modern discourse should focus on inclusive growth and development more than more that there is a need to integrate the tribal rights with the sustainable resources to use, not just about the displacement and rehabilitation frameworks. And in the conclusion of this answer, what you have to write in the conclusion of this answer, in fact, the rehabilitation and displacement actually form the core of tribal development in India. The true progress of the tribal communities must demand a holistic and a comprehensive approach, and that approach must be a participatory approach, multi-stakeholder approach, and a broader approach. And in this approach, it respects or it gives the tribal autonomy, socio-economic integration, and it also ensures that the development does not perpetuate the marginalization of the tribal communities. And this is how you have to write the introduction for this answer. And that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.